Nobody expected the global food system to stumble because of a creature that weighs 2 kilograms and cannot fly. Yet this is the pattern. The smallest biological shifts become economic earthquakes. When the 2022-2023 wave of avian influenza swept through North America, it killed or forced the culling of 58 million birds, and what followed was not just a shortage, it was a signal flare. Because the price of something as ordinary as eggs didn't just rise, in many regions it tripled, shocking households that had assumed food inflation was temporary and manageable. Here's what nobody tells you. Food crises don't behave like normal shortages. They behave like financial contagions. And that's where the hidden story begins. The connection to the viewer's financial present is immediate. When the price of a staple product breaks from its traditional range, it often reveals deeper structural fragilities that analysts suggest could surface again in other sectors. A dozen eggs going from $1.50 to $5 might seem like an inconvenience, but in economic history, small price distortions have often been the first domino. In 1973, soaring grain prices triggered political instability across multiple continents. In 1918, influenza didn't just devastate populations. It disrupted agricultural labor so severely that food scarcity became a secondary crisis. And in 2015, during the last major U.S. avian flu outbreak, egg prices didn't merely rise. They spiked by nearly 84%, setting a precedent for the shock that would escalate years later. Each time, the chain reaction followed a similar rhythm: biological stress, supply contraction, panic buying, speculative storage, price amplification. The modern episode, however, hides one massive question that Section 2 will finally answer. If a single disease event can trigger such dramatic movements, what happens if a future wave strikes simultaneously across multiple protein sources? But before we reach that point, let me show you exactly how this crisis truly unfolded. At first, the pattern looked manageable. Avian influenza has circulated for decades. Its periodic flare-ups usually burn out after seasonal migration shifts. But in late 2022, the virus didn't behave. It spread in colder months, it jumped between migratory flyways, and it hit dense commercial farms first, the very nodes critical to national egg supplies. Analysts reviewing the timeline note that the virus's speed was unprecedented. In some regions, entire flocks had to be culled within 48 hours of detection. At first, it looked like a temporary inconvenience. Then the bill arrived. And this is where the emotional and financial chain reaction began. For families, eggs are one of the cheapest sources of protein, until they aren't. As prices climbed week after week, households adjusted diets, bakeries cut production, food manufacturers reformulated products, and small restaurants removed breakfast items. Every ripple reinforced the next. Everyone thought they were safe. They weren't. Because this wasn't simply about the price of eggs, it was about the structure holding the entire system together. This is where the pattern begins. The modern food supply chain is built for efficiency, not resilience. Farms specialize intensely. Distribution networks operate on thin margins. Supermarkets track inventory through algorithms that assume tomorrow will look like yesterday. When 58 million birds disappeared from the system, those assumptions shattered. Yet the economy reacted as if it were dealing with a financial asset. Fears of future shortages led to hoarding. Distributors increased order sizes just to be safe. Some retailers secured private contracts at higher prices, pushing smaller buyers out. The crisis magnified itself long before the virus was contained. Here's why this matters. Crises rarely start in the moment you notice the damage. They start earlier, quietly, in the architecture of the system. The 2022-2023 avian flu didn't reveal a weakness in birds. It revealed a weakness in us, specifically in the way modern economies stack efficiency over redundancy. To understand this more clearly, we need to travel back in time, because this type of disruption has happened before, and history leaves breadcrumbs. Take the 1918 influenza pandemic. Although the world remembers the deaths, the shadow crisis was agricultural collapse. Entire regions faced manpower shortages. Crops rotted, distribution networks collapsed, food prices surged. Newspapers in 1919 wrote of silent inflation, a term eerily relevant a century later. When a biological threat hits the foundation of a food-producing system, everything downstream becomes unstable. Then look at 1973, when geopolitical shocks drove grain prices so high that governments imposed rationing. Panic buying wasn't just emotional, it was mathematical. When people fear scarcity, they unintentionally create the scarcity they fear. Economists studying the period noted a consistent behavioral pattern. 2 months of price rises triggered 6 months of hoarding. The mechanism that fueled that crisis reappeared during the chicken shortage. But the closest parallel to the current crisis is 2015, the last significant U.S. avian flu event. That time, the virus affected about 50 million birds, slightly fewer than the recent outbreak. Yet even then, egg prices spiked dramatically, and the supply chain needed nearly 2 years to fully recover. Producers cleaned facilities, rebuilt breeding stock, and fortified biosecurity systems. But analysts now argue that the 2015 response created a dangerous illusion, that preparation was sufficient, and that future outbreaks would follow the same mild economic trajectory. Not this time. The 2022-2023 wave collided with a global landscape already stressed by inflation, geopolitical tensions, fertilizer price surges, and energy shocks. The virus was the match, but the economic environment was the powder. This is why the price reaction was so disproportionate. It wasn't the virus alone, it was the context into which the virus arrived. Here's the mechanism behind the first stage of the crisis. The modern egg supply chain is dominated by a small number of vertically integrated producers. When one of these giants loses a flock, it isn't just a local shock, it removes a major percentage of national supply. The 58 million birds culled were not scattered randomly. They were clustered in high-output facilities responsible for large segments of the market. And because egg-laying hens take 5 to 6 months to reach productive capacity, there's no fast restart button. The system has a long recovery lag built into it. Here's what nobody tells you. This lag is what transforms a biological event into a price bubble. It creates the perfect conditions for fear-driven purchasing, which fuels price escalation, which fuels more fear. And because eggs are a foundational ingredient in thousands of processed foods, the cost increase spreads silently across multiple industries. A single missing product becomes a multi-sector inflation driver. The story then takes a deeper turn. Small farms, once seen as vital buffers, found themselves disproportionately harmed. They lacked the capital reserves to absorb sudden feed cost increases. They couldn't match the contracts secured by major buyers. Many halted production or downsized. Some closed permanently. A system that was already concentrated became even more concentrated. And concentration creates vulnerability. This is why analysts suggest the egg shortage may be a glimpse of something larger. Not a singular crisis, but a template. A demonstration of how dependent economies are on tightly linked biological systems, and how quickly those systems can unravel. As one agricultural economist phrased it, if this pattern applies to other protein markets, a disruption in poultry today could resemble a beef or pork shock tomorrow. Here's the hidden implication. The crisis wasn't just about chickens. It was about what chickens represent, a test of the system's ability to withstand biological volatility in an age where that volatility is increasing. But to understand exactly how the crisis mutated from a supply shock to a structural warning sign, we need to look at the second historical case that many overlook: Japan's 2021 bird flu episode, which forced the culling of record-breaking numbers of chickens and caused severe egg shortages across multiple prefectures. The economic consequences rippled into consumer prices, industrial production, and even school lunch programs. At first, the system adapted. Then the shortages deepened, and households that never thought about supply chains suddenly found themselves making substitutions, altering weekly budgets, and confronting the uncomfortable truth: food systems can break. The parallels to the U.S. crisis were not identical, but they revealed a disturbing similarity. Dense, efficient, profit-maximizing systems break in the same way. The virus doesn't have to be new. The vulnerability is what's new. Everyone thought the recovery would be fast. It wasn't, because the story didn't end with the cull of 58 million birds. It began there. The real impact was the systemic instability revealed in the aftermath. a pattern that Section 2 will explore in full detail. The danger wasn't what people saw in the supermarket aisle. It was what they ignored in the structure behind it. And what comes next may change how we think about food security in the decades ahead. The story of the chicken shortage does not end with millions of birds lost. That was only the spark. The deeper impact, the part analysts now examine closely, begins in the months that followed, when the recovery exposed structural weaknesses far more serious than the initial outbreak itself. At first, it looked like the system would snap back as it did in 2015. Facilities cleaned, restocked, and reopened. Farms replaced lost hens. Consumers assumed the worst was over. But here's the mechanism. Biological shocks don't reset the clock. They rewrite it. And every attempt to rebuild the poultry supply chain revealed how fragile its foundations had become. The first sign was the breeding lag. Laying hens take half a year to mature, but that delay didn't just slow production. It shifted the entire supply calendar. Producers who usually staggered breeding cycles suddenly synchronized them, creating a wave of hens that would all age together. Analysts studying the pattern suggest that this synchronization could create future bottlenecks, with egg supply rising and falling in larger, more volatile cycles. At first, the adjustment looked harmless. Then, the long-term implications began to surface. As farms restarted, feed prices surged again due to global grain instability. Energy costs remained high. Labor shortages persisted. All of these pressures raised operational expenses precisely at the moment producers were trying to rebuild. Here's what nobody tells you. A crisis doesn't only damage supply, it increases the cost of restoring it. And that cost embeds itself into every future price. A system that once operated on predictable margins suddenly found itself balancing uncertainty on every front. And this is where the pattern reveals its second stage. A handful of large integrators gained disproportionate power. They could withstand cost surges, negotiate with distributors, hedge risks, and secure early access to vaccines or enhanced biosecurity tools. Smaller producers, however, struggled to re-enter the market. In some regions, reports indicated that local farms that had survived earlier decades could not reopen after the 2022 to 2023 outbreak. Not because of the virus, but because the post-crisis environment priced them out. The supply chain became more concentrated and more brittle. Here's why this matters. Concentrated markets don't absorb shocks, they amplify them. When a small system can fail quietly, a large system fails loudly. The disappearance of local farms reduced the diversity of supply routes, making supermarkets more dependent on fewer sources. And dependency is the precursor to vulnerability. To understand how these vulnerabilities evolved, consider the second historical case that completes the pattern, the 2015 outbreak's aftermath. That crisis appeared resolved, but its long-term effects lasted years. The industry rebuilt based on assumptions that the next outbreak would behave similarly. Short-lived, geographically limited, and manageable with existing protocols. But the 2022-2023 wave defied those assumptions. It was more persistent, more geographically widespread, and more resistant to containment. This revealed a systemic flaw, planning for the past instead of planning for volatility. Analysts examining this evolution now propose three major scenarios that could shape the future of poultry and egg markets. Scenario 1. The soft recovery. In this outcome, producers continue strengthening biosecurity, new vaccines reduce viral spread, and price volatility gradually declines. The system stabilizes, but at a higher baseline cost. Eggs never return fully to pre-crisis pricing, but the extreme spikes become less common. Some economists argue this is the most likely path if global disease pressure remains moderate and governments invest in monitoring migratory bird routes. But even in this mild scenario, the lesson stands. Food systems have become permanently more expensive to maintain. Scenario 2. The rolling volatility cycle. If avian flu becomes endemic, seasonal outbreaks could create recurrent supply contractions. The market would not collapse, it would oscillate. Prices would rise sharply during waves, fall partially during recovery, and repeat. This scenario resembles the boom-bust rhythms seen in the pork market during the 2018 African swine fever outbreak, which decimated herds across Asia and sent pork prices soaring. Analysts suggest that if this pattern applies to poultry, households could face unpredictable food budgets for years. Businesses that depend on stable egg prices, bakeries, restaurants, packaged food manufacturers, would restructure operations around uncertainty. Scenario 3. The hard break. This is the darkest possibility. If a highly pathogenic strain spreads simultaneously across key producing regions, North America, Europe, South America, the global poultry system could experience synchronized collapse. In this scenario, protein shortages would ripple across markets. Consumers forced to substitute eggs might turn to dairy or meat, raising demand and pushing those prices higher. Some agricultural researchers propose that under such pressure, alternative proteins, plant-based or lab-grown, could accelerate their market share dramatically. But the transition would be chaotic. Food security discussions would shift from price stability to supply assurance. This scenario is not presented as inevitable, but as a demonstration of how tightly modern diets are tied to a vulnerable biological system. Here's the trap. Societies believe food is permanent, cheap, and guaranteed. But the chicken shortage revealed a psychological blind spot. Households absorb small price increases without worry. They assume tomorrow will resemble yesterday. But when a foundational food item suddenly triples in cost, it breaks that illusion. People begin to notice the fragility they once ignored. Historical patterns show that when food stability disappears, it triggers shifts in public sentiment, political pressure, and economic behavior. Not panic, awareness. And awareness is the beginning of systemic change. To understand who lost the most in this crisis, we must examine the hierarchy of exposure. Consumers bore the financial burden first. Low-income families who rely on eggs as a primary protein source faced difficult choices. Budget meals became luxuries. Assistance programs strained to keep up with rising costs. Substitutions, rice, beans, powdered mixes, became common. But the shock spread upward. Small bakeries experienced ingredient cost inflation that cut into margins. School cafeterias adjusted menus. Manufacturers reformulated goods to reduce egg content. But the true losses were experienced by small producers. Many relied on thin operating margins. The combination of culls, rising feed prices, DAG, and delayed recovery broke their financial resilience. When they closed, the market lost both supply diversity and buffer capacity. This loss made the entire system more dependent on large integrators, precisely the entities that become pressure points in future crises. Yet some players adapted. Large producers leveraged scale to rebuild faster. Some invested in controlled environment barns, enhanced filtration systems, and new monitoring technologies. Distributors expanded cold storage capacity to buffer future supply shocks. Retailers renegotiated long-term contracts and diversified import options. Even consumers adapted, exploring alternatives like flax-based or aquafaba substitutes during peak price spikes. Every adaptation revealed both flexibility and fragility, two sides of the same pattern. Here's what nobody tells you. Crises accelerate transitions that were already underway. Before the outbreak, discussions around alternative proteins were growing slowly. After the shortage, their adoption curve quickened. Food manufacturers explored reformulations. Investors increased funding for egg alternatives. And although these substitutes remain niche, analysts suggest they may gain strategic importance in the decades ahead, not because they are trendy, but because they reduce exposure to biological volatility. But the biggest revelation came from the question few thought to ask. What if this crisis wasn't just about chicken supply, but about the broader architecture of food systems built on global concentration? In recent decades, food production has leaned toward specialization. Regions produce one item efficiently and depend on imports for the rest. This model works flawlessly in normal times. But when disease, conflict, or environmental shocks hit, specialization becomes a liability. The chicken shortage demonstrated that even wealthy nations with advanced agricultural infrastructure are not insulated from disruption. If this pattern applies to other sectors, vegetables, grains, livestock, the world could face an era where food price shocks become more common, not exceptional. The danger wasn't what people saw on the shelf. It was what they didn't see. The entire network of farms, facilities, feed suppliers, distributors, and retailers that keep the system running. When one part fails, the rest trembles. By the end of the recovery period, egg prices eventually fell from their peak, but they never fully returned to their previous range. The shock left a permanent imprint. Analysts now frame the crisis as the opening chapter of a new era in food economics, one where volatility is built into the system, not imposed on it. And that leads to the final, unresolved question. If a single biological event could create such widespread economic turbulence, what happens when simultaneous disruptions strike multiple staples at once? Because that is the scenario quietly shaping conversations in agricultural circles, supply chain institutions, and policy forums. Not a collapse, analysts warn against that certainty, but a structural transformation. A world where resilience becomes more valuable than efficiency, where redundancy is not waste, but insurance. Where the most ordinary foods may become strategic assets. Here's the mechanism. A fragile system forces societies to rethink what they take for granted, and that is the true legacy of the chicken shortage. It wasn't a temporary crisis. It was a rehearsal,